To introduce Dr. Dipayan Ghosh, a fellow at New America and the Sorenstein Center on Media, Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, where he works on digital privacy and civil rights issues. Dr. Ghosh received a PhD in electrical engineering and computer science at Cornell University and also studied for postdoc at Berkeley's School of Information and Princeton Center for International Technology Policy. Dr. Ghosh has worked on global policy issues at Facebook, as well as technology economic advisor in the Obama's administration in the White House. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Ghosh to the stage.
Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. It's so wonderful to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. My talk is going to focus on the market ecosystem that underlies the internet and how it really drives a lot of the negative externalities that we've seen over the past couple of years, in particular. And this is work that I did with a collaborator of mine named Ben Scott. We've all heard quite a lot over the past few weeks and months about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and many of the privacy harms that have come to light, and in particular the fact that over 50 million people's Facebook data was breached, and in fact the number was 87 million, and many of them happen to be American voters. And that this data went to Cambridge Analytica eventually, which got it through an academic's efforts, through a survey on Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg testified in Congress, in the U.S. Congress, and in Europe, and yet we really don't have much progress on addressing this set of problems. At the same time, we've also seen egregious examples of disinformation operations from many different countries. This is an example of Russian disinformation operations in the context of the US presidential election in 2016. In other words, we see that this type of content, disinformation operations, and even legitimate political communications are really making a rise on the information medium of the day, which is the internet and particularly social media. I want to discuss the underlying infrastructure, but also recognize that there is an implicit demand for disinformation, which is harder to address and is a longer-term issue. But I want to dive into this, starting with the infrastructure. We all know about the traditional advertising space. It involves advertisers like Chanel and publishers like the New York Times, often working through an ad agency. And this is how things worked in the era of Mad Men, in the 50s and 60s in Manhattan. You have advertisers working with publishers who are trying to place ads in relevant outlets. The ecosystem has really evolved since then. And we still have advertisers like Chanel and publishers like the New York Times or the New Yorker, but in between them we have a whole set of digital intermediaries, from demand-side platforms to ad exchanges to supply-side platforms to ad networks and many others, including digital consulting firms that advise each of these nodes. So it's a far more complex system with respect to what we saw in the 50s and 60s in the traditional advertising space. What underlies all of this is the exchange, the algorithmic and programmatic exchange of data and money and information across this network, and it happens on a hair trigger within milliseconds. I want to take you back to 2011 and look specifically at the example of Facebook as a case study. In 2011, Facebook was on a high. In fact, Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies were on a high. We had just seen the Arab Spring happen, and it really blossomed on these networks, particularly Facebook. And just imagine the sheer emotion of the Egyptian people who really were able to rise up and express their emotions, express their feelings, and come together to change their own lives and reject much of the oppression that they were subject to at the time, and over many years. And this all happened thanks in large part to the internet, and in particular to Facebook. Facebook was on a high, in other words. At the time, its usership was around 500 million, and that number has grown linearly to 2.3 billion today. But the key here is that their revenues have actually grown exponentially over this same period, from about 3.7 billion to today 45 billion a year. And this exponential growth really is a strange thing when compared to the linear growth in their usership. How did this happen? Well, it was around this time that Facebook introduced a whole series of advertising technologies. And Facebook is just an example, and this is true across the internet. But it was around this time that the company did that. And namely, these technologies included the Power Editor, ads in the newsfeed, custom audiences, lookalike audiences, and partner categories, all released within a couple of years of each other in this era, when this industry was really on a high and wanted to really move forward and integrate some intelligence into the operation of ad routing. Diving into each of these very quickly, the Power Editor is very simple. It's just a manager. It's just a platform that allows an advertiser, like let's say a digital marketer for Nike, to enter their account, examine the ad campaigns that they have running, and initiate new ones. That's all it is. But it's a very simple but very powerful tool that is actually the go-to for many digital marketers today. Custom audiences is a slightly more complicated, but at the end of the day, pretty simple tool. Imagine a small local business in Tel Aviv that sells flowers. The business might choose to collect business cards of clients and patrons and customers over the course of a day, and let's say they've collected 40 business cards in the day. What that business could do is take down the email address for each of those 40 business cards, register those emails through Facebook's ad manager, and try to map those customers, known customers who visited their store physically, in the digital space on Facebook, so that they can target them with ads. So the custom audiences tool is pretty simple. Just take known information about a known customer, an observed customer, and try to map them to Facebook. And the match rate, depending on the context and other variables, the match rate might be anywhere from 20 to 60%, typically, in a place like Tel Aviv or New York. A slightly more complicated tool is the lookalike audience. And the lookalike audience is essentially taking the observed customers that you have. So let's say if you're that flower shop and you've observed 40, if you have 40 business cards and are able to match 20 of them on Facebook, that set of 20 is your observed list. The lookalike audience, when an advertiser triggers a lookalike audience on Facebook, what Facebook does is they take the 20 customers that you know in your custom audience and try to assess their personal interests and their beliefs and their likes and dislikes and behaviors, and they try to match you up with more customers that you don't know, that you've never had exposure to in the past, but who are predicted to enjoy your service or your product, or predicted to have some propensity to buy it. And you can create a custom, you can create a lookalike audience that has thousands of people, so that you can reach those thousands of people that you don't know directly with advertisements about flowers, let's say. But of course, the example can become far more nefarious if you're talking about a fake news website, or the propagator of misinformation or hate speech. This can be a powerful tool for legitimate digital advertisers, but it can be a tool that can be wielded for tremendous harm, particularly in the socio-political context. Another example of a tool that Facebook has, which is also pretty common across the industry, is called partner categories. That's the feature. That's the feature that Facebook has in partnership with data brokers. The product on Facebook is called partner categories, but the practice underlying it is basically to pipe data broker data into the platform for advertisers. So a data broker might know, for example, that you walked into an Audi dealership 2 weeks ago, because they have a partnership with Audi, which collects your signal through its Wi-Fi or collects your email address. And Audi has that commercial relationship with Axiom or Oracle or some other data broker. That data broker now can take that information that you walked into Audi, or that you, let's say, purchased a pair of socks on a week ago. It can take that information and pipe it into a platform like Facebook. And that can allow, let's say, Audi or Mercedes or BMW to go back and target you with an ad because you walked into Audi 2 weeks ago. Again, what I'm describing is a benign example, but you can imagine particularly egregious examples that do perpetuate harms against people. Last tool I'll mention is very simple. It's the ad in the newsfeed. People overlook it, but this was only integrated just a few years ago. But this type of native integration of advertising into your content that you're seeing about your friends and news and so on and so forth is both engaging and dangerous. So that's a set of the tools that are being used here, but the point here is really that the commercial interests of disinformation operators and those of the internet platforms are one and the same. They are aligned. That is the practice of trying to engage you in an experience like the news feed, or like the Messenger application, or like Google search engine results pages, or the Twitter feed, to keep you looking at the screen for as long as possible, and thereby show you more ad content and collect more data about you so that they can target you with more ads in the future. Meanwhile, those are the goals of the internet platform. The goals of the disinformation operator are slightly different, but put simply, they are to persuade and influence you. But because of the fundamental goal of showing you as much content and collecting as much data about you as possible, that's something that's shared between both entities, and that's something that is dangerous. I want to point out that underlying the whole ecosystem, as I mentioned earlier, is the use and collection of personal data, highly sensitive data. This is just an example of one kind of data that is widely collected and used across the industry, which is precise location data. And this is an example of somebody's iPhone location in southwestern England. But as you can see, you can see exactly where this individual has been. But speaking more directly, location data reveals not just where you work and where you live, but it really tells sophisticated advertisers and other people who know how to understand the data and build models against that data. It really helps them understand your personal interests and your beliefs and your behaviors and routines in a way that no other kind of data can really reveal. And that's why it's so useful in the digital advertising context. as we can see, I mean, there's a lot of evidence of applications that have persistent requests for location. And even when you say don't allow, or even when you say I don't want to provide my location data, they'll ask you the next time you open the app. I also want to mention that underlying the whole ecosystem is the integration of opaque algorithms. Weak artificial intelligence is obviously being used quite often these days as a term, but really this is just a set of tools that has been around for decades, which now we're calling AI because it has taken on a form that is tremendously powerful, given the rate at which we have accelerated our capacity to collect data, store data, and analyze data. There are many forthcoming applications of AI in digital advertising, and it is already used in digital advertising. So for example, when Facebook composes a custom audience, it uses a machine learning algorithm to do so. It tries to understand the features of the custom audience and apply them across its universe of known users to understand who might be a good person for your lookalike audience. But there are some interesting applications of AI that could raise some eyebrows in the future. Michael Solmeyer mentioned one of them, which is the use of deep fakes, or faking a video of President Obama or Donald Trump or another disinformation, let's say another public figure trying to that disinformation operators are trying to manipulate. And that is exactly this, the automated creation of content using AI. But another slightly more sophisticated example is the use of contingency-based ad targeting. This is the practice of taking all the variables at hand in a potential ad campaign. That is, what the ad content is, what color it is, which celebrities you feature in an ad, so on and so forth, alongside all the demographic details of your ad audience, like their age and their gender and their social preferences and so on and so forth, and showering each. Just imagine this as a giant matrix of demographics against ad content, and what sophisticated operators are going to be able to do into the future is test each and every one of these combinations. Let's say there are thousands and thousands of combinations. Test each of those combinations and see what really sits well and resonates with particular audience segments, and what doesn't. So that you can really, as soon as, let's say, the North Korean dictator uses some kind of rhetoric, or as soon as a political candidate loses an election in the deep south of America, you as a disinformation operator can trigger an ad campaign or a content campaign that should be targeted to particular audience segments. Imagine just 1,000 people in a particular locality with your malicious content. That's a capacity that is going to ramp up as we look at for example, the U.S. presidential midterm elections in 2018, the Canadian elections, and into the future. The other thing here is that despite all the steps that these companies are taking, whether it's to be transparent in who is behind the funding of a political advertisement, or whatever it might be, the fact of the matter is that the core tools and technologies that Breitbart and Steve Bannon and disinformation operators have used over the past several years is actually only getting more and more sophisticated. And that core technology is the collection of data, the processing of that data, and the use of AI to target content at particular audience segments. That is something that's not going away, because that's the core business model that we're talking about for internet companies like Facebook and Google. And as much as they might try to institute transparency, they will have trouble in trying to pick up the disinformation operators and the hate speech propagators without breaking down, in some sense, the the alignment they have with disinformation operators. So how do we fix this? Well, there's a broad policy agenda that could be considered. I think it starts with data rights, and Europe is already leading on this with the General Data Protection Regulation. But I think what we need to start, the place where we need to start is understanding the business model. The business model is three-pronged. It's premised on the creation of tremendously compelling services like Messenger or like Google image results that are borderline addictive. It moves to the collection of data on individuals through those services. And finally, it is premised on the development of opaque algorithms for content curation and for ad targeting. And the treatment of that business model that can break down disinformation operations and hate speech, amongst other negative externalities, is really premised on bringing a sense of privacy back to the individual. There are a few other measures that we could consider, from ad transparency to public interest audits, to enforcement of antitrust in the industry. But I will leave it there for now. But I also want to just recall that there's a broader issue at play here. This is an example of Russian disinformation in Poland. The particular this is reported by the EU Disinformation Operations Cluster in Brussels. In this particular example, the fake story was that NATO was showering chemtrails over Poland. The broader issue is that people who are trying to push disinformation and hate speech onto the world are not going away. There will always be a demand for it as well, because there are people who absorb the content and for whom it resonates. And I just want to leave it there and just say that this is a complicated issue, and even if we consider a broad policy agenda to try to address it, we have to be thoughtful as to how we do it to maintain a commitment to national security measures, but also maintain our commitment to free speech. Overall, Ben and I, my collaborator Ben and I, believe we need to think about a new form of a digital social contract to give the individual a little bit more power in the face of the industry. GDPR is a good example, but I think in the rest of the world we need to start thinking more robustly about solutions that can move us forward as well. Thank you, and I'll leave it there.